Good morning and welcome to today's hearing on our country's emergency alert systems. I hope to hear from our panel this morning about what's working, what's not, and what we can do to better prevent false alerts like we saw with the Hawaii ballistic missile warning earlier this month. Ensuring state and local governments have the proper tools and safeguards to properly alert the public of an impending emergency is absolutely critical. False alerts not only create an unnecessary panic, they undermine the integrity of the emergency alert system, leading to public distrust and confusion. What happened in Hawaii is inexcusable and must be addressed to ensure an incident like that never happens again. It is essential that Americans have an emergency alert system that they can trust, and overwhelmingly, by and large, I believe they do. There's much that is working well with the emergency alert system. In fact, it's arguably a model public-private program operating as envisioned by this committee through the Warren Act. Industry partners, including those represented here today, have been investing to improve the system and are working collaboratively with government and public safety officials to carry out the mission. We certainly do not want to overlook these successes, but as recent events have shown, there are problems that must be addressed. Today's hearing will be the first of 2 hearings on emergency alert systems. In the near future, we'll hold a field hearing in Hawaii to further address the January 13 ballistic missile false alarm and to follow up on the issues that are discussed today. Since the early days of the Cold War, the United States has been building and improving an emergency alert system to warn our citizens, first from the risks of a Soviet attack and later expanded to include natural disasters like fires, floods, tornadoes, and tsunamis. We have continued to build on this life-saving system to include Amber Alerts, which seek the public's assistance when a child is in danger. Soon we'll also have Blue Alerts, which can be issued when there is an imminent and credible threat to a law enforcement officer. From the beginning, our emergency alert systems have harnessed the immense resources of commercial communication systems, broadcast television and radio in the beginning, and eventually cable and satellite TV and mobile phone networks to reach the American public as quickly and effectively as possible. Here is how the system works, or should work. Our alert system relies on federal, state, and local officials authorized by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, to decide when an alert is appropriate and what it should communicate. These alerts are then sent to FEMA. When FEMA receives an alert, it validates that it is from an authorized entity before forwarding it to the broadcasters, mobile phone service providers, and others, who in turn send the alert out on televisions, radios, and mobile phones in the affected areas. The Federal Communications Commission regulates the interface between those sending the messages and the communications companies that deliver the messages to us. Ensuring that people get the information they need and that alerts are credible and make sense to the recipients is an ongoing process, but it is fundamental that messages must be credible. Messages sent in error, like the Hawaii ballistic missile alert, run the risk of undermining the entire alert system by reducing people's confidence in alerts. While we do not want to prevent authorized officials from communicating alerts to the public when they see fit, we must ensure that such officials are better trained. There are additional improvements we can undertake as well. For example, there is no question that the National Weather Service's watch and warning system saves lives, but it can also be enhanced. That is why I included provisions in the Weather Research and Forecasting Innovation Act of 2017, which became law last spring, that require the National Weather Service to use the latest behavioral science and stakeholder feedback to improve its watch and warning system. We should make sure that lessons learned from one incident inform and improve future alerts. The FCC is also taking steps to make improvements to the alert system through the use of better geo-targeting of messages, which is being considered at its current proceeding. That is, targeting messages to those who need to receive them and not sending them to those who don't. This helps avoid alert fatigue and also addresses the concerns expressed by some local officials during the California wildfires last year that an overly broad alert could result in traffic jams with those unnecessarily leaving homes and hindering the evacuation of those who really, truly do need to leave. As we'll hear today, the goal of providing timely emergency information to our communities is also advanced by private citizens, like those amateur or ham radio operators who have helped keep people connected after tragedies like Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Ms. Lisa Folks, Chief of the FCC's Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, Mr. Scott Bergman, Senior Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at CTIA, the Wireless Association, Mr. Sam Matheny, that's right? Matheny, thank you, Matheny, Executive Vice President and Chief Technology Officer at the National Association of Broadcasters, and Mike Lysenko, a representative of the Amateur Radio Relay League. Thank you all for being here. I look forward to today's discussion And I will now recognize the ranking member, Senator Schatz, for any opening remarks that he may have, and I think he can speak personally to the impact of this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For many people in Hawaii, one of the most harrowing hours of their lives started just a few minutes after 8 a.m. on January 13th, 2018. Cell phones across the state lit up with a warning that a ballistic missile attack was imminent. For the next 38 minutes, both residents and visitors panicked. People were terrified as they scrambled to get in touch with loved ones. I know, because I was home in Honolulu that morning and I started to get dozens of texts with screenshots of the push alert asking me what was happening. Meanwhile, within a minute or two, officials at the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency had spoken to the Pacific Command and confirmed that there was no missile attack. Only nobody told the rest of us. The people of Hawaii may be relieved about the false alarm, but they are also angry. All of this was avoidable, from the false alarm itself to the series of mistakes at multiple junctures surrounding the incident. Human and bureaucratic errors made the crisis worse, but there are also inherent flaws in the system itself. We're here today because of problems in our emergency alert systems, from Hawaii's false alarm to issues in communications related to the recent California wildfires. So I want to thank Chairman Thune and Ranking Member Nelson for holding this hearing and for agreeing to hold a field hearing in Hawaii in the near future. And I want to thank the FCC, including Ms. Folks, who came to a meeting I convened last week with FEMA, the DOD, and the Department of Homeland Security for helping us to determine what happened and how to fix it. What happened in Hawaii raises some basic policy questions. Right now, any city, county, or state can choose to participate in this program on missile alerts. And when they do, they gain the technical ability to get the word out, but that does not make them experts in knowing when a missile is coming. That rests with the Department of Defense. And it is increasingly clear to me that if we get all 50 states and all the territories and 3,007 counties across the country participating in this program, the likelihood of another mistaken missile alert as a result of human or bureaucratic error is not zero. Local officials have led on disaster response and recovery, but if the federal government knows a missile is coming, it is worth asking if they should be the ones to tell everyone. States are laboratories of democracy. They should not be the laboratories for missile alerts, which is why this is an important question for Congress to consider. We have lively debates about federalism, about the role of local versus federal government. But a missile attack is federal. A missile attack is not a local responsibility. Confirmation and notification of something like a missile attack should reside with the agency that knows first and knows for sure. In other words, the people who know should be the people who tell us. That is why I'm introducing legislation with Senators Harris, Gardner, and others to make it clear that the authority to send missile alerts should rest with the Departments of Defense and Homeland Security. These agencies have to work with the state and local emergency management agencies when they get the word out so that the public is safe and informed. Thank you again, Chairman Thune and Ranking Member Nelson, for your leadership on this issue, and I look forward to hearing from the witnesses on where we stand and what we can do better.
Thank you, Senator Schatz, and thank you for sharing your experience, and we all look forward to working with you to make sure something like that never happens again to your constituents or anybody else in this country. So, Ranking Member Senator Nelson is here. Senator Nelson, opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And by the way, I thought yesterday's hearing down at the auto show was outstanding about automated vehicles. So thank you. I think there's going to be a lot of good come out of that hearing.
I hope you're right. Very interesting. Thanks.
If you were told that a ballistic missile was inbound and your loved ones were spread out, what in the world would go through your mind? It's exactly what went through the mind of Senator Schatz. Regrettably, he knows the answer to that question, and he knows it's very real and it's very personal. He was there. He received the alert. And it's because of that personal connection to this situation and the leadership that he has shown in the aftermath that I'm going to be here simply to support him in this. Nobody should have to go through what the folks of Hawaii did, but the flip side of that is we want to make sure that there is a system in place so if there is an inbound nuclear warhead, our people are alerted. When disasters occur, Americans rely not only on the emergency alerts, but also the 911 system. But the infrastructure is aging. And frankly, it's been left behind in the digital revolution. Congress must make modernizing the 911 system a national priority, which is why I've worked with Senator Klobuchar to introduce the Next Generation 911 Act of 2017. And I hope this is something. We need a template for moving ahead on bipartisan things, and this is a good bill to start moving ahead on.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. It's something hopefully this committee can work together and get done for the good of all the people in this country, and of course, most specifically for the people of Hawaii. We do have a great panel we look forward to hearing from this morning, and we'll start with Ms. Lisa Folks, who is the Chief of Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau at the Federal Communications Commission, which has jurisdiction over all the integration of all these forms of communication. Mr. Scott Bergman, who's Senior Vice President, Regulatory Affairs, CTIA, and Mr. Mike Lysenko, who's Chairman of Advocacy Committee, Amateur Radio Relay League, and member of the Board of the Directors, and Sam Matheny, Executive Vice President, Chief Technology Officer at the National Association of Broadcasters. So we'll start, Ms. Folks, with you, and if you all could confine your oral remarks to 5 minutes or thereabouts, we will make sure that all of your testimony gets made a part of the written record, but it'll give us some time to ask questions. So, Ms. Folks, please proceed. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Nelson, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you to discuss our nation's emergency alerting systems. The false ballistic missile warning issued on January 13th by the state of Hawaii was absolutely unacceptable. It resulted in widespread panic, and the extended period it took to correct the error, nearly 40 minutes, compounded the problem. Looking beyond the immediate consequences of the mistake, which were serious in and of themselves, this cry of wolf damaged the credibility of emergency alert messaging, which can be dangerous when a real emergency occurs. The Commission acted swiftly to open an investigation into the matter. That investigation is ongoing, but based on current information, it appears that the false alert was a result of two failures. First, simple human error. Second, the state did not have safeguards or process controls in place to prevent the human error from resulting in the transmission of a false alert. Last week, the FCC sent 2 employees to interview representatives of the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency and other stakeholders. The Hawaii Emergency Management Agency tells us that it is working with its vendor to integrate additional technical safeguards into its alert origination software, and has changed its protocols to require 2 individuals to sign off on the transmission of tests and live alerts. We are quite pleased with the level of cooperation we have received from the leadership of the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency thus far. We are disappointed, however, that one key employee, the person who transmitted the false alert, is refusing to cooperate with our investigation. We hope that person will reconsider. Moving forward, the Commission will focus on ways to prevent this from happening again. Federal, state, and local officials throughout the country need to work together to identify any vulnerabilities to false alerts and do what is necessary to fix them. We also must ensure that, should a false alert nonetheless occur, a correction is issued promptly in order to minimize confusion. Emergency alerting systems provide timely and life-saving information to the public, and we must take all measures to bolster and restore the public's confidence in these systems. While the incident in Hawaii is very present in our minds, we cannot lose sight of the fact that the Wireless Emergency Alerts, or WEA, has greatly enhanced public safety. In the last 5 years, WEA has been used to issue over 33,000 emergency alerts. In California, WEA was used 4 times in response to the 2017 wildfires in Northern California and 16 times for the Los Angeles area wildfires. WEA was also used extensively in all areas affected by the 2017 hurricanes. The Commission has taken significant steps to enhance alert capabilities by leveraging advancements in technology. In September 2016, the Commission adopted rules to enable wireless alerts to contain more content and to enable support for alerts written in Spanish. When the WEA program launched in 2012, participating wireless providers were generally required to target alerts to a county or counties affected by the emergency. As of last November, all participating wireless providers are now required to transmit alerts to a geographic area that best approximates the area affected, even if it is smaller than a county. To further improve WEA, next Tuesday, the Commission will vote on an order that would require participating wireless providers to target alerts with an overreach of no more than 1/10 of a mile and require carriers to preserve WEA alerts for 24 hours. In closing, we look forward to partnering with emergency management professionals from your jurisdictions on the alerting capabilities that they need to use America's public alert and warning systems with confidence during times of crisis. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Folks. Mr. Bergman.
Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Nelson, and members of the committee, on behalf of CTIA, thank you for the opportunity to testify about the critical and successful role of wireless emergency alerts. CTIA commends this committee for its focus today on this issue and for your leadership on it over the last decade, extending back to the passage of the WARN Act in 2006, which created the Wireless Emergency Alert, or WEA, program, a partnership between the wireless industry, government, and public safety officials. Since its launch 5 years ago, wireless emergency alerts have become a critical resource for hundreds of millions of Americans who rely on mobile phones every day. Today, wireless providers serving more than 99% of U.S. subscribers voluntarily participate in WEA. More than 33,000 WEA alerts have been sent, helping to locate those in danger and warn of imminent threats or dangers. CTI members are deeply committed to ensuring that WEA remains a trusted and effective resource for the American public. So the recent false alert in Hawaii underscores the importance of the functionality, integrity, and credibility of our nation's emergency alert system. With that in mind, my testimony will address the vital role that WEA plays, our ongoing efforts to enhance its capabilities, and the importance of maintaining the system's integrity. A decade ago, this committee recognized the value of wireless emergency alerts to reach nearly every American. Now, as more than half of American households are wireless only, WEA has become an essential tool for public safety officials to reach Americans wherever they are. WEA is part of our broader national alerting system. Federal, state, and local authorities transmit emergency messages to FEMA. FEMA authenticates and formats messages for distribution to the various national alerting systems, and wireless providers deliver authorized WEA messages to the targeted area, as determined by alert authorities. Wireless providers do not control message content and do not exercise discretion over whether to transmit messages. Because local authorities can target WEA alerts to a particular area, they're extremely effective at reaching those Americans directly impacted by an emergency. WEA's unique sound and vibration help ensure that everyone is aware of the alert. Wireless emergency alerts have helped to return abducted children. They've warned millions of people in the path of severe weather events like flooding, tornadoes, and wildfires. And they've helped law enforcement catch terrorist suspects in the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing and 2016 Chelsea bombing in New York City. And we continue to expand WEA's capabilities. In the past year, the FCC has adopted rules to expand the content that authorities can send to consumers, adding additional characters, Spanish language, blue alerts, and downloadable content from embedded links, as well as support for additional state and local testing. We've supported these enhancements because our members are committed to the proven life-saving success of WIA. Next week, the FCC plans to adopt an order that further enhances WIA's geo-targeting capabilities. Today, WIA alerts can be targeted down to the cell sector level, a significant improvement over WIA's initial county-level targeting. Given the expanding public safety mission for WIA, CTI supports the FCC's proposed enhanced geo-targeting framework, which can help public safety minimize over-alerting through innovative device-based solutions. Significant standards, deployment, and testing work still need to be done to support this capability. For this reason, we'll be challenged to meet the FCC's proposed timeline of November 2019, but the wireless industry will work intently to do so. Finally, the false alert in Hawaii underscores that public confidence in our national alerting systems must remain our highest priority. Alert originators must send warnings appropriately and judiciously. FEMA must authenticate messages quickly and accurately, and providers must deliver messages to the targeted area. We commend this committee and Chairman Pai for working quickly to identify lessons learned from this event, and we appreciate Commissioner Rosenworcel's call for additional best practices. There will be many lessons learned, but this event also demonstrates that the technical capabilities of the WIA system work. For this reason, policymakers and the public should have confidence that in the event of a real emergency, authenticated information can be disseminated rapidly and effectively through the wireless emergency alert system. CTI is proud of the critical role that WIA plays in our national alert system and is committed to working collaboratively to maintain public confidence. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bergman. Mr. Lysenko.
Good morning, Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Nelson, and distinguished members of the committee. It is a great privilege to address you this morning in my capacity as a member of the Board of Directors of the American Radio Relay League, the National Association for Amateur Radio. ARRL has approximately 175,000 members throughout the United States, and we represent the interests of the 750,000 licensed amateur or ham radio operators in the U.S. Amateur radio is an avocational pursuit. We are radio experimenters and we are communicators, but there is also a very serious side to amateur radio. It is far more than a hobby. With our license from the FCC comes a responsibility to promote emergency communications during times of disaster. The ARRL maintains memoranda of understanding with the U.S. military, FEMA, and DHS. We provide all of the emergency communications for the American Red Cross and the Salvation Army. To quote former FEMA Administrator Craig Fugate, quote, "As much as we think we are sophisticated with technology, things break. Seeing how amateur radio in a disaster, in a crisis, oftentimes was the one thing that was still up and running, a ham transmitting can mean the difference between life and death," end quote. Amateur radio operators are included in emergency communications plans in every state of the Union. The role played by hams in disasters was on full display in the fall of 2017, which saw 4 major hurricanes make landfall in the United States and its territories. These storms caused significant damage in Florida, Texas, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. In advance of, during, and in the aftermath of each one, trained amateur radio operators using radio stations in their homes and portable and mobile facilities responded in large numbers. Hams provided critical weather spotting information from their residences to the National Weather Service and the National Hurricane Center. They joined dozens of their brethren in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands after Hurricane Maria to provide restoration communications for the U.S. military, FEMA, DHS, and first responders. They provided health and welfare communications where no other method of communication was available. They provided all of the communications for the Red Cross and the Salvation Army. The Red Cross requested and ARRL dispatched an additional 50 amateur radio operators equipped with emergency communications kits outfitted free of charge by ARRL to help restore communications in the immediate aftermath. And as discussed in our written testimony, they did a multitude of other things, all at no cost to the public or to the federal government. In Hawaii, our teams are prepared to assist in the case of any emergency, whether natural or man-made. For example, in the immediate aftermath of Maria, an amateur radio operator in Maui was highlighted on Hawaii News Now for his work in connecting a Maui family with relatives in Puerto Rico. He did so using an effective outdoor antenna and a station from his residence, which he would also utilize in the event of a disaster in Maui. After the January false alarm, MSNBC's Left Field reported that, quote, "In the case of electromagnetic pulse from a blast, 90% of the people will be without communication, and ham radio is actually one of the ways that you will be able to hear what is happening throughout the islands, whether or not people are okay, who is alive, end quote. While ARRL and the amateur radio community rarely need anything from the federal government, what we must have is an effective outdoor amateur radio antenna in order to practice our avocation on our properties. The ability to practice our craft is crucial to our being ready to perform when needed in a crisis. To do that, we must have some sort of effective outdoor antenna. Deed-restricted communities undermine the ability of the amateur radio community to be ready when disaster strikes. These restrictions present any outdoor antennas of any size or height. Today, 90% of all new housing starts are done so under deed restrictions, all of which preclude amateur radio antennas. What Senators Wicker and Blumenthal have done with the Amateur Radio Parity Act is to strike a necessary balance between a ham's desire to install an antenna and the HOA's right to govern the size and placement of these antennas. It is important to note that the bill is different than the legislation opposed by Ranking Member Nelson in 2015. At that time, the distinguished senator from Florida expressed reservations about the legislation, stating that he supported amateur radio, but, quote, there must be a happy compromise, unquote. Based on his stated concerns, ARRL began intense negotiations with Community Associations Institute, the only national association for homeowners associations, lasting several months. These discussions culminated in a happy compromise endorsed by CIA and ARRL, as well as the American Red Cross and the Salvation Army, and the compromise bill has passed the House by voice vote twice. We hope that this committee will extend its support to the Wicker-Blumenthal Bill S-1534 to ensure that the amateur radio community continue to be relied upon when a disaster strikes. Again, I thank the committee for the opportunity to speak to you today about the role of amateur radio in a disaster. I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lysenko. Mr. Matheny.
Good morning, Chairman Thune, Ranking Members Nelson and Schatz, and members of the committee. My name is Sam Matheny, and I am the Chief Technology Officer at the National Association of Broadcasters. On behalf of the thousands of free local television and radio broadcasters in your hometowns, thank you for inviting me to testify on the emergency alert system and how broadcasters fulfill their roles as first informers, and how innovation will allow broadcasters to do even more to keep viewers and listeners safe during emergencies. Broadcasters take seriously their role as the most trusted source of news and emergency updates, whether it's preparing listeners and viewers for the coming storm, directing them to needed supplies and shelter during the disaster, or helping rebuild in the aftermath. Local stations are part of the communities they serve. And broadcasting is sometimes the only available communications medium in an emergency when wireless networks fail. Morning Consult recently found that the American people turn to broadcasters in times of emergency by a factor of more than 3 to 1. Broadcasting is unique for the following reasons. First, broadcasting covers virtually everyone. Broadcast signals reach more of the U.S. population than any other communications medium. Broadcasting is localized. Local broadcast stations can deliver market-specific information as well as national alerts. Broadcasting has no bottlenecks. An emergency alert can reach millions of people simultaneously without concern over network congestion. Broadcasting is redundant. There are numerous independently operated stations in each market that deliver alerts. Broadcasting is resilient. Stations often operate with backup equipment, generators, and fuel supplies to keep stations on the air. Broadcaster information is actionable. Radio and television can provide enough information to enable people to understand what is happening and what steps they should take. And finally, broadcasters are trusted. They are members of the local community and speak not just as an authority, but as a neighbor. But broadcasters do more than just deliver messages to the public. Broadcasters are also the backbone of the emergency alert system. Working with the government since the 1950s, broadcasters have operated and evolved a nationwide wireless network to deliver emergency alerts. This daisy chain of broadcast stations ensures that emergency alerts can be delivered independent of internet connectivity and even when power outages disrupt other forms of communication. In fact, Broadcasters serve as primary entry points for emergency communications to the public and are thus part of the solution from beginning to end. Because broadcasting plays such an important role in this critical communications infrastructure, it is vital that the government support and foster broadcasting. I'd like to briefly outline 3 key areas for your consideration. First, the Next Generation Television Standard, ATSC 3.0, which was recently approved by the FCC, has many features that will improve emergency alerting, including the ability to wake up sleeping devices, more precise geo-targeted alerts, and sending rich multimedia files such as weather radar images, evacuation maps, and even video files with detailed explanations about the emergency and what to do. New regulatory hurdles should not be placed in our way as we deploy next-gen TV. Second, broadcasters are in the final and most complicated phase of the incentive auction, the repack phase. Nearly 1,000 television stations will be moving to new channel assignments, and this will also impact over 700 FM radio stations on co-located towers. Broadcasters need the time and money required to make these moves successfully and without impairing the public's ability to access emergency alerts. I ask for your support of the Viewer and Listener Protection Act, sponsored by Senators Moran, Schatz, and 8 of their colleagues, and urge its passage as no station should be forced off the air due to a lack of funds or unreasonable time constraints. And third, broadcasters have been working with the wireless phone manufacturers and service providers on market-based solutions to activate FM chips in smartphones. Our market efforts have been successful with one very notable exception, Apple. We believe Apple should be encouraged to activate the FM tuner in future models of their iPhone, as it will improve people's access to vital information in times of disaster. In conclusion, in emergencies large and small, our nation and your hometowns benefit from a strong and vibrant broadcast industry. FEMA calls broadcasting a redundant, resilient, and necessary alerting pathway. I agree. Thank you for having me here today. I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Matheny, and appreciate all of you talking about the important roles that each of the organizations that you're on behalf of play in this overall process. I'd like to start with Ms. Folks and ask you if you could describe or explain to us the role the FCC plays in the emergency alert system and how that interacts with the larger, what they refer to as the IPAWS communication system. Kind of just how does the FCC, that's sort of where this committee's jurisdiction and interest is, how do they relate in this whole sequence of events?
The FCC is responsible for the distribution part of the EAS and WIA. In other words, we adopt and administer rules that apply to the communication service providers that participate in those two systems. For example, with respect to WIA, we have rules that would apply to the participating wireless carriers in terms of how their infrastructure is to react when it receives the alert. Certainly issues like geo-targeting are the types of things that we would govern. With respect to the EAS, what capabilities their EAS equipment must have in order to receive and transmit an EAS alert. We do not have authority over the alert origination piece, which is the part of the system where government agencies decide whether to issue an alert, what the alert is what information the alert is going to include, the target area. That's not within our purview. FEMA oversees the integrated public alert and warning system. So basically, you kind of think of it as 3 pieces: the alert origination piece, the IPAWS piece, which is FEMA, the distribution by the communication service provider, they are participating by, under rules that are adopted and administered by the FCC.
Do you see any need to change the rules based on this incident?
That's something that I really can't answer. The FCC doesn't have a position on that. I think in terms of that, it wouldn't be so much changing a rule. It would be something that would have to change in terms of our authority. Certainly, if Congress decided it wanted to make changes, we would stand ready to provide technical assistance with any draft legislation. And obviously, if Congress enacted some legislation, we'd obviously implement it.
Well, do you have, is the FCC, to that point, ever exerted jurisdiction over alerting authorities and to require that their best practices used and to make sure that there are adequate safeguards in place to prevent false alerts?
No.
And do you think, I mean, is it the, do you believe the Commission has the authority or tools that it needs to ensure that an incident like the one that happened in Hawaii never happens again, currently?
Given the fact that the problem was on the alert origination piece, the FCC does not have authority over in that area.
Right. Okay. So just to ask, I guess, the obvious question, at least the one intuitively that I thought of when I heard about all this, and that is, so you describe this as a three-part process, and the FCC is on the distribution part of it, the origination alert, and then the FEMA clearinghouse function. It seems to me, why then did, this is a ballistic missile threat. I mean, this is a DOD, this is like nuclear war type thing. Why was a state agency involved in that alert? And I understand, you know, we have a lot of experience in my part of the country with weather, and so the National Weather Service works closely with FEMA, and all those alerts go out if there's a potential tornado threat, that sort of thing. But it seems to me, at least in this case, I'm still at a loss as to how, if there's an origination of the alert and then sort of a clearinghouse, how that got so messed up. Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Well, from the FCC's perspective, we really can't give an opinion on that. We are not involved in any way in deciding who issues what alert. That is a decision that's on the alert, purely on the alert origination side. In terms of this specific incident, I would have to refer you to FEMA and DHS.
Okay. Mr. Bergman, could you just briefly talk about the wireless industry's role in that emergency alert system? And I know you talked about it generally in terms of the role that you all play, but particularly in light of this recent discussion and whether, you know, it's been a success in your view.
So thank you, Chairman Thune. I think time and again we've seen over the last 5 years that wireless emergency alerts are a lifesaver. They've helped return kids who have been abducted. They've helped folks avoid tornadoes that are rolling through their town. And now we're starting to see them used for blue alerts to help identify and locate suspects. And there are a couple of key reasons why. The geo-targeting, right? Wireless emergency alerts are the only tool in our toolbox right now that help find you where you are and get that message to you right then. And now as we continue to improve wireless emergency alerts, we've given the ability to access URLs and embedded links and content so that you can get that information and act on it, and that's a powerful combination.
Okay. Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Folks, thank you for everything that you and the FCC have been doing. I have a number of questions. I'm going to give them to you all at once, and you can either take them for the record to the extent that you're still undergoing the investigation in Hawaii, but whatever you can answer would be great. I think the first question is, you know, who gets an alert and who doesn't? And in that category, you have the people who turn off the push notifications. So my first question, and again, I'm going to try to run through them in the interest of time, is if on television, a TV, broadcast TV or cable TV watcher doesn't have the opportunity in settings to turn off those alerts, we presume that everyone must know over those over the airwaves. why do we allow people to turn off alerts of that magnitude? Maybe a blue alert or an amber alert is another matter, but in terms of a missile, an incoming ballistic missile, it seems to me that we should have a system that doesn't give anybody discretion about whether or not they get told that an alert is coming. That's number one. Number two is, my understanding is that although this is a voluntary system with the providers, the push alerts that is, we still have about 99% coverage. I just want to confirm that's true. And then number three is, we now have a bunch of people who are watching TV in different ways, and we still depend heavily, as we should, on our broadcast partners' TV, and let's not forget the importance of radio, especially in rural America. But we also have cord cutters who are on YouTube or Hulu or whatever it may be on their iPad, and no alert comes over that system. So I'm wondering whether the FCC has done any thinking about how to make sure that people who are watching television in a non-traditional way get those alerts.
On the first question, which I believe you were referring to the opt-out option. Under the WARN Act, people can opt out of all but an alert that is issued by the president. So the ability to, and I should point out, with WIA, unlike some other types of subscription-based alerting systems, it's an opt-out function versus an opt-in. But with the exception of anything that's coming from the president, the statute allows wireless carriers to offer the option to opt out.
And one of the questions we have into the National Security Council is, why is this not just very clearly, either by executive order, executive memorandum, or by practice, why is a missile, incoming missile, not absolutely the kind of thing that would ride on that presidential alert? Because although in the drafting of the WARN Act, I'm not sure that specifically was contemplated, this seems to me to be the highest priority alert, and therefore perfect for a presidential alert.
That's a question that the FCC, again, would not be able to answer.
Not your lane, I got it.
In terms of the second question, which I believe was about whether it's voluntary.
No, the second question was carriers, and I believe we have about 99% coverage, even though it's a voluntary program. And then the last question is, how do we reach cord cutters? How do we reach people who are watching TV in non-traditional ways, not cable, not broadcast?
That's a very good question, and that's something that the FCC, that's something that we can certainly look at within our authority.
So that's what I was going to ask, is that could you get back to us about whether you need additional authorities to try to move that along, or whether you have existing, and if you do have existing authority, I'd like to know what you're going to do to kind of solve that problem. And if you don't, then I think that it's incumbent on the Commerce Committee and the Congress to try to fix that. And then just a quick clarification, did the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency need FEMA to sign off on a correction to the first push notification?
No.
Okay, there was some...
They did not need permission from either FEMA or the FCC.
Okay, and then my final question for Ms. Folks is, one of the challenges with our broadcast partners, KSSK is the radio station that is responsible for getting out emergency information. They couldn't get on the phone with Hawaii Emergency Management Agency. They couldn't get on the phone with PACOM. The governor was having difficulty getting through to DOD. I was having difficulty getting through to the governor. What do we do about the phone line problem when everybody is panicking and trying to communicate with each other? Text messages, spotty, and we need to have phone conversations. It seems to me that the FCC, at least in their investigatory process, has to assess the extent to which we had problems, not just in terms of the systems for communicating with each other, in terms of who calls whom, but also that literally people who really needed some sort of red phone to be able to talk to each other were not in a position to do so at the technical level.
That's something that we can take back and look at as part of the investigation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Schatz. Next up, Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Senator Schatz for his leadership. I can't imagine what that must have been like in your state. I had, of course, many Minnesotans like to go to Hawaii. I wonder why. And I had my state director was actually there when this happened and told the story of how he had in a hotel condo with no basement, didn't know what to do. They're taking things like anything they can find for an emergency packet. And when you think about that story repeated for families with kids and how scared they were, there clearly changes have to be made. So I wanted to focus on the legislation that we've been working on with Senator Nelson. And I think it's very important that we upgrade, and I'm co-chair of the Next Gen 911 caucus. First of all, I introduced last Congress with Senator Fisher, and this is more on the rural focus, the Rural Spectrum Accessibility Act, and it was included in the Mobile Now Act that passed the Senate. Mr. Bergman, how can spectrum disaggregation and other incentives be used to increase wireless coverage in rural areas?
So thank you, Senator Klobuchar. We really commend you and appreciate your work on that Rural Spectrum Accessibility Act. As anyone from rural America knows, there are real challenges making sure that we have service out there in the hardest to serve areas. Geography is challenging, topography is challenging, sparse populations make it difficult. So we need to do things to make it easier to serve out there. And by creating incentives to put spectrum to use in rural areas, we can give providers greater incentive and lower the barriers to building out networks. And that's a perfect tie-in to our focus here today, making sure, as you talked about, that we have the most recent 911 services, that we have wireless emergency alerts. All of that is dependent on making sure that we can build out to those rural areas. So, we believe that legislation will help advance that goal.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Folks, ensuring that the right people receive an emergency alert, as Senator Schatz has pointed out, the FCC will be voting soon on an order that would require wireless providers to target alerts within 1/10 of a mile. How will the FCC verify that the wireless alerts being sent out satisfy these new requirements?
At this point, because the proposal hasn't been voted on by the commission, I can't get into more details about what the order may or may not say.
Mm-hmm. Could you talk about, as Senator Nelson and I work to pass this bill, how would interoperability between systems increase effectiveness on advanced alert systems?
That's an issue I will have to take back.
Okay. The order of the FCC will soon consider, will allow local public safety officials to better target emergency alerts. The FCC order will require participating providers to shift from a network-based approach to one that also uses the location capabilities within cell phones to target messages. Once operational, this will minimize the likelihood that someone outside of a disaster area receives an unnecessary alert. Mr. Bergman, how will wireless providers work with device manufacturers to ensure this new functionality?
So thanks, Senator. That's really at the heart of the FCC's order that will be considered next week, and something that public safety has identified as the single most important improvement to wireless emergency alerts that we can have. If you sort of turn back the clock, when wireless emergency alerts were first launched, you could target to the county level. And today, now we've improved that. You can target down to the cell sector, to the individual cell tower. And what this capability will let us do is not only use that targeting of the network, but also to use intelligence in the device to try to figure out whether the device is within that target area that's identified by the alert authorities. So we think this is going to be a really significant improvement, that it will help address that over-alerting and benefit public safety and consumers. Okay,
very good. Mr. Matheny, one last question here. Alerts over traditional broadcast networks have long been a reliable way, and certainly we use broadcast all the time in Minnesota for flood. When we have floods, daily reports get out there for people. Broadcasters are often able to continue operating during and after severe weather, which we often have in the Midwest. With new technology, broadcasters broadcasters may soon be able to deliver additional information to viewers on fixed, mobile, and handheld devices. What level of targeting will this new capability provide, and what additional alerting measures can broadcasters make available?
So I believe, thank you, first of all, and I believe you're speaking of the next-gen TV standard, ATSC 3.0, and the advanced alerting capabilities that are therein. First of all,
that's a nice way of describing what I said in too simple of words. Thank you. Yes, that's exactly what I was talking about.
The next-gen TV standard, first of all, allows for waking up devices. So if a device is asleep, it can be woken up. That is a distinct feature that was designed in. Once the device is woken up, you have the ability to do targeting. The standard has just been completed, and the actual implementation of that is still being developed, but it will be similar to what Mr. Bergman just described, and using the location of the device to determine if it's in the affected area. Because we are still talking about a one-way broadcast delivery of the alert. And additionally, the next-gen standard allows for sending multimedia content. So you could think of an evacuation map. You could think of, if it's a tornado track map. You could think of an like I said, an evacuation, or even a video file. That would come down and tell you explicitly what is happening, and that would be a video-on-demand file. Now, this would be in addition to the normal coverage that our stations provide.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. And Senator Klobuchar is looking for the Vikings 3.0, too.
Okay, really? Did you? I mean, this has nothing to do with the Vikings. This is like about Hawaii that doesn't have an NFL team. Oh, I'd like to point out, or South Dakota, for that matter, that then you decide you can take pot shots at my team, but well, let us not forget that catch.
Okay, wow. We got to go back to the good stuff. All right. I have Senator Udall up next, but Senator Sullivan has to preside on the floor. Could he ask his questions next? That'd be okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Udall. And I'll just come clean. We don't have an NFL team either. So I'm. And thank you, Senator Capito. I just had one. It's just a couple questions, but I'm just going to ask them at the same time for Ms. Folks. It relates to a very kind of a big event that occurred in Alaska just on Tuesday morning, very early in the morning. A 7.9 magnitude earthquake hit in the Gulf of Alaska. As a result of this earthquake, many of my constituents in coastal communities were alerted to the threat of a tsunami and told to relocate inland. Many did. It was pretty much in the middle of the night. However, some of our carriers were not able to send the notification because of the lengthy and complicated process required by the FCC to set up emergency alerts on their systems. This is particularly the case with regard to many of the carriers in Alaska are small companies. So going through the lengthy process, complicated process that the FCC puts a big burden on them. Are there things that you are looking at with regard to streamlining the process to take into account some of the smaller companies that can participate? And also related, there have been reports that several coastal Alaska radio stations did not get their EAS signal after the earthquake at all, or got it 30 minutes after the wireless alerts went out on cell phones. Can you speak to that and what you're trying to do on those issues? And I know I asked a couple questions. I thank my colleagues again for indulging me here. It's an important issue for my state and others.
I'm not sure what they mean by a long process of the FCC. Under the FCC's rules, if a wireless carrier wants to participate in WIA, they send us a notification saying that they're electing to participate in part, which may mean some of their geographic service area but not others, or it, in part, could also mean they're not offering WIA on all of their cell phones, or they can elect to participate in full, which basically means they're participating across all their devices and all their geographic areas. Once they've done that, the only thing for them to do is what other carriers would be required to do, is to have the WIA, to be able to offer the WIA capable phones and to be able to make sure that their network is set up to receive WIA alerts. But there's, other than the election itself, there isn't some drawn-out process with the FCC that they would have to go through.
Okay, well, maybe what we can do is work with you and some of our smaller carriers who have had concerns. And then on the question of the radio stations?
That's something we actually are looking into. The tsunami alert that occurred up in Alaska, that's something that we can certainly look into and include in our investigation.
Good, because if we can learn from this, I mean, fortunately there was no tsunami, but it was very scary for,
right,
you know, hundreds, if not thousands of my constituents. It would be good to be able to learn from this so we can be ready next time.
Right.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. Senator Udall.
Thank you, Chairman Thune, and thank to you and Senator Schatz for focusing on these very important questions. My understanding, some of your questions probably could have been answered by FEMA, and FEMA is not at this hearing, and I know that you requested them, but it seems to me we should try to get some answer some way. I'm happy to participate in a letter or however you want to do that, but I think we need the answers to your questions based on the answers we've received from this panel, which they don't seem to have the information, especially Ms. Folks at that time. FEMA, who we should be directing things to, don't you think? On some of those questions you were unable to answer, you said you didn't have authority.
To the extent that you're asking about anything other than the our authority or our regulation of the communication service providers' participation, I would agree.
Yeah. Ms. Folks, it's my understanding that the states are required to file emergency alert systems plans with the FCC. Mm-hmm. There are a few tribal nations whose reservations cross at least one state line. In the case of New Mexico, we have the Navajo Nation, which is in 3 different states. Are tribal nations under that same requirement of filing?
No, the tribal nations do not have to file separate EAS plans. What typically happens is, to the extent that there are parts of tribal nations and states, those states take into account the need of those tribal nations. That's certainly how the New Mexico state EAS plan is set up.
Good, good. Thank you. It's important to every bureau of the FCC to engage directly with tribal nations, and have you had the opportunity to work with tribal nations on their unique public safety needs?
Certainly. For example, the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau oversees an advisory committee, the Communications Security Reliability and Interoperability Council. We have had representatives of tribal nations serving on that committee, in addition to which we had a separate committee of 911 centers focused on next generation 911. We had representatives of tribal nations on that committee as well.
Yeah, and as all of you probably know, it's very important to get these alerts out if you have wireless, but many of these tribal nations don't have it at all, and so that you're dealing with an additional huge hurdle in terms of getting emergency alerts and those kinds of things into tribal nations' territory. Mr. Matheny, I appreciate the work that our local broadcasters do every day, but particularly in times of threats of public safety, such as during wildfire season, which we have in the Southwest and we've seen at various places around the country. As you're aware, broadcasters in New Mexico rely heavily on translators to serve rural communities. And I'm concerned that the ongoing spectrum repack process could leave these rural consumers behind. It's my understanding that the current allocation of $1.75 billion is inadequate to meet the needs of the broadcasters relocating. Is there a better estimate of the amount of money that's needed, including the funds needed to ensure that translators do not go offline in rural areas?
Thank you, Senator Udall. So you are certainly correct that $1.75 billion was allocated.
And that's the number that I believe Chairman Pai testified to.
Yes, and so Chairman Pai has testified that there is not enough money.
Yeah.
And so he is on the record with that as well, and we certainly don't believe there's enough money either. Based on the initial results of the cost estimates submitted by TV stations, the real number is going to end up being around $3 billion. And so there's a substantial disconnect in the funds available and what's really going to be needed. And so we are certainly keen to see the Viewer and Listener Protection Act that Senators Moran and Schatz have sponsored to take hold and get approved because we think it's going to be necessary to make sure that stations stay on the air and are able to continue to operate, including translators. And in the context of this hearing, that certainly means that emergency alerts are still going to be available to those populations.
Yeah, and I'm also an original co-sponsor of that bill. I think we have to make this investment. I don't think there's any doubt about it. I've got a couple of additional questions, but I'll submit them for the record. Thank you to the panel very much.
Thank you, Senator Udall, and your point's a good one. We did attempt to get FEMA here. They need more lead time, evidently, to prepare for this. Maybe in light of what happened, they need it. But I do think that there are questions that, obviously FCC is this committee's jurisdiction, FEMA is DHS, but that only they and others can answer, and I'm hoping that we'll be able, by the time the field hearing in Hawaii occurs, to get the other parties to this discussion involved and engaged and hopefully able to answer some of those questions. I mean, there still, to me, are unanswered questions, but I know there are attempts already legislatively to cure some of the problems that we had this time around. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the ranking member, and know it's been a difficult several days and weeks since this occurred. And I'm kind of going to go on the FEMA thing. I just want to get this question on the record, Ms. Volks. I'm pretty sure you don't know the answer to this question, or you don't have it. But I think it's the one question that many people, when they read the story, at least at a cursory level, sort of wondered, and that is, how is it that a single government employee could trigger an alert without any kind of meaningful mechanism to sort of override, or, you know, do you want to delete? Do you want to delete? You know, was there any, and so do you have any light to shed on that basic question?
That's actually one of the issues that we're exploring as part of our investigation, what Hawaii's process, what happened and what Hawaii's process was.
I think we'll all be interested in hearing that. Mr. Matheny, were the warnings broadcast over TV?
Yes, they were.
In a scrawl kind of a thing, or how was that presented to the viewer?
Yes, they were. There were crawls on TV, and then it was an audio played on radio.
Okay, because I actually was talking with somebody yesterday who was there in a hotel room, and they must have missed the first scrawl on the TV, but they did get the warning system through their phone, both of them. They were visitors. But I wanted to tell Senator Schatz that the hotel they were staying in was right on top of it. They were a warning system to the entire hotel with directions as to what they should do, encouraging everybody to come in, go, I mean, I'm sure frantic, but to go to the basement. And so I would say, since you have so many tourism and so many people staying in hotels, that's good to know that your tourism industry is reacting quickly to something like this. So that's one of the best practices that came through. And so let me ask, I also want to thank Mr. Matheny, too, for the broadcasters when we had our 1,000-year flood in June of 2 years ago. I am convinced we would have lost more lives than we did had we not had the rapid response, both through the radio and certainly social media, but also through our broadcasters. So thank you for that, and also thank you for the broadcasters for staying on the story. It wasn't a one-day story for us, and it wasn't treated as such by the broadcasters.
Sure, and thank you for recognizing that. I think that is one of the key elements of broadcasters, is that they are local and part of the community, and committed to helping prepare, weather, and recover.
Right. Mr. Bergman, let me ask you a real simple question here. If you're in a no-service area on your phone, do you get these alerts?
So you need to be within the coverage area in order to receive a wireless emergency alert, which really does put a premium on the conversation we were having earlier about making sure that we're doing everything that we can to make coverage available in rural areas.
This is a major issue for us, not just on the wireless side, but obviously on the broadband side. And we have, in our state, particular challenges because of the rural nature, but also the geographic nature of the state of West Virginia makes it difficult. But when I can drive 8 miles outside of my capital city and lose coverage, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. I know you know this, so I just wanted to reemphasize that. And lastly, I just tell a little story. On December the 7th, 1941, my uncle was stationed at the Schofield Barracks in Hawaii when Pearl Harbor was attacked. And my mother was 15 at the time. And the one story that she told us that was kind of interesting, especially in this day and time when you're talking about instantaneous messages and instantaneous retraction of messages within 40 minutes, which sounds like a lifetime, but she told me that if it weren't for the ham radio operators, her parents would have never known that their son was okay. But it took days for it to come across the country. And I'm sure some of those messages were not quite as positive as the one my grandparents and my mother received that day. So, Mr. Lincecum, your organization's long history is well appreciated.
Oh, thank you very much, Senator. And if I may, amateur radio was also involved in the effort to achieve normalcy in Hawaii after the false alarm. As a matter of fact, Hawaii, the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service in Hawaii, activated a UHF and VHF repeater system, and they monitored the alerts and the cancellations. Ironically, 20 hours earlier, they had drilled with the Hawaii State Emergency Management this kind of scenario, and so 20 hours later, there it was right in our face. We had operators present at the Emergency Operations Center and at the state warning point for Hawaii Emergency Management. The false alarm was on various information mechanisms within 13 minutes, and amateur radio operators started to pass that message along, whereas the full false alarm notice came 38 minutes from the initial alarm. Amateur radio operators were trained in Hawaii to listen to specific types of siren wailings, and each one would determine what kind of emergency there was. There was no siren, and so that led to a tremendous amount of confusion. They also received reports from a Coast Guard vessel relaying the cancellation notice before the official cancellation notice came out. So amateur radio operators knew pretty much earlier than anybody else as to what was going on and did start sending that message along.
The other issue I'll just say briefly, if I could take just a few more seconds, that I think is real in relaying the story of the folks that were in Hawaii visiting. The skepticism over this is a test and this is real, even though it was explained that it was real. I do think if we perfect the system, we won't have this testing fatigue, or where you're getting tested and nothing's really happening. And I think that's our immediate response sometimes. And so I think the better the system gets and more reliable, the less frequently it needs to be tested. Or you can test it in different places and don't have to test it always at the same site. We'll really go to this sort of mentality of, well, this is a false alarm, it's not really happening, I'm going to wait it out and wait and see what happens. So I encourage all your efforts in that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Capito. Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. And I'm just referring back to an earlier conversation on the committee. I just want everyone to know that there is actually a professional football team from Massachusetts, and it will be playing in about 10 days in a game out in Minnesota. So I just want everyone to be on notice to be looking for that. Mr. Bergman, you said that the rule will be implemented in 2019 to increase the character count for mobile emergency alerts from 90 to 360. Can we get it done more quickly in 2019? How can we telescope the time frame to get this done? It's obviously a big problem.
Thanks, Senator. And certainly, we do think that additional capability, having those additional characters, will be helpful. Will let us pass on more information to consumers, let public safety explain situations better to consumers. We are certainly an industry about over-delivering. So we've hit every deadline that so far in terms of WARN Act implementation. We certainly want to try to do that again here as well.
So you can get, you could set a goal of completing it in 2018?
Well, you know, I wouldn't want to get ahead of the FCC's current deadline, which is May of 2019, but I can tell you that we'll be doing everything that we can to hit that deadline, and if we can, beat it.
Yeah, I think we already saw that deadline is a little bit too far out. We definitely need, obviously, to deal with the problem. So let's just talk, for example, about what could happen at a meltdown at the Pilgrim Nuclear Power Plant in Massachusetts, which is at the bottom of the list of best managed nuclear power plants in the United States. And of course, people in Cape Cod would have to actually ride past the plant to evacuate, so it gets a little bit more complicated. So I guess my question to you would be, when this event just occurred in Hawaii, the message was ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii, seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. So what would be the message that went off the emergency? What would be the information that was communicated to people if there was a nuclear power plant meltdown? And where would they be told to go? Would they be told to shelter in place? Would they be told to evacuate? Here, there was no additional information. Where do you go? What do you do? We were just running crazily around town. So if there is a nuclear meltdown, we still have 100 plants in America, and it's clear that an accident can happen. Fukushima is the most recent, but it is possible. Should there be more information, Ms. Folks, that is part of the message which is sent out? So it not only warns people, but gives them kind of a little bit of guidance as well, with more than 90, perhaps with as many as 360 characters, you know, so that there's guidance that families receive.
Well, one of the main reason why the commission expanded the character limit of the WIA alert from 90 to 360 was because of the need to provide more information, in addition to which the commissions also adopted rules that would allow for the WIA alerts to include embedded references. Originally, the rules did not allow telephone numbers or URL link into the WIA alert. The commission has now, given the advancement in technology, decided to allow those to be included. There's certainly other issues that are before the commission that we are considering in terms of other types of information or additional information that can be provided.
Yeah, so I think that's very important, and I think it has to be tailored, because people would want to know, do I shelter in place, or do I just run crazily out into the street and head towards what could be the problem? And I think that's really one of the big issues that has been identified, and we're going to have to clarify that. And just going back to the Hawaii incident, I don't know how much thought has been put into this question of state control versus federal control, because obviously the North Koreans could also make a miscalculation if they think that we are preparing for nuclear war. If they think that the United States might have a hair trigger response capacity, you know, that is going to be triggered by this emergency evacuation plan that has been triggered. So has anyone thought through that reality, that the North Koreans could completely misinterpret what is going on and actually move them closer to their own hair trigger just to prepare, because the United States might be actually on the verge of attacking? Has anyone thought through that issue as well?
From the FCC standpoint, as you know, we're focused on the communication distribution side. That's another issue where I would have to refer you to FEMA and DHS.
Yeah, and I think decisions like that should be made by the president and by the Pentagon and not by state officials. I think it's absolutely imperative that that it be put in that larger context of understanding how the North Koreans might be responding, because it's already too close, the hair trigger between our two countries. Too many threats have already been issued, so a misreading of that by the North Koreans could have actually resulted in a much more catastrophic situation. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Markey. Senator Cantwell's next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member, thank you for holding this hearing. When it comes to the Pacific Northwest, I guarantee you, with tsunamis and earthquakes and volcanoes, flooding, worried about lahars, name it, we pay a lot of attention to disaster issues. And I'm reminded, having been on the committee for some time, our former colleagues, Senators Stevens and Inouye, spent a lot of time on the development of what is the buoy system, which is our earliest detection on the waves so that we can have this information. And now NOAA is working very diligently on interpretation of that activity so that we can get the information to handheld devices. So it is, I think we need to be thankful that we've made the investment in technology. I think the question becomes, who in the federal government owns the protocols for making sure that the coordination happens at the state and local level if so many of the partners in the development of that communication or the communication itself, for example, the Weather Service, who I know isn't with us this morning, how do we make sure that that information is there? So for us out on the Long Beach Peninsula, this issue is a very big issue. We have established warning sirens and warning information, but and I think the scientists at NOAA would tell us this is what we should be developing, but now we have a very rural, isolated community trying to figure out how to deal with a tsunami. Many people may remember this story that the New Yorker wrote a few years back, the big one. I never heard from so many of my friends around the United States when that article appeared, because they all woke up and said, this is really what's going to happen. So we train constantly on this as a coordinated effort between Homeland Security, our National Guard, our local responders. But who owns, at the federal level, thinking through what this communication protocol should actually look like and how we establish safeguards within the protocol so that these kinds of mistakes or information gaps are avoided in the future? Because we want to continue with the information, that's for sure. So does anybody have a thought on that? Ms. Flowers, Mr.
In terms of the communication service provider side, certainly the FCC works with the service providers. We have rules that apply in terms of how they're supposed to react in terms of receiving and transmitting the alerts. On the alert origination side, on the FEMA side, I'd have to refer more to them. I will say that just in terms of general coordination, the FCC has at times coordinated, well, not just at times, but regularly coordinates with FEMA in terms of things such as testing or dealing with some of the issues that go to our rulemakings. To give you an example, with respect to the EAS, there's a lot of states particularly on the western side of the country, who do tsunami and earthquake tests, and they want to use the live code EAS, which under our rules you can't use unless it's an actual emergency. We have, working with broadcasters and other EAS participants, waived our rules to allow the broadcasters, the cable operators, to transmit that live code test as part of the broader tsunami exercise that FEMA may be doing with a state or local government.
This isn't, I'm not trying to stump the panel. It's more that I think we have a gap here. And I know in our state, because the National Guard and the tech sector are so strong, they've established what they call hygiene issues for cybersecurity. Here are the 10 things that you should follow for good cybersecurity hygiene. Somewhere, it seems to me that we need this protocol list of here's what emergency response should look like, and here are the safeguards that should be in place, whether you're talking about a county or a state or, you know, the federal system, because we're going to keep marching ahead. We need this. We need the information. We desperately want this kind of, when it's an earthquake, you only have, you know, you might only have minutes to respond. And because, as I said, this article about the big one in the Northwest, we want to see this data and information. But we also want to make sure that, like the things that happened in Hawaii, also have new safeguards for false alarms. And I remember Senator Inouye talking about a previous moment in Hawaii's history prior to all this technology where they had, I think it went on for hours, he said, they thought a tsunami wave was going to hit, and so this went on for hours and hours. And that's why we developed the buoy system, so that the buoy system did work the other night in Kodiak, and it gave people, even though that it went off, it gave people time to then understand from the science level that the wave was not going to be that great. So we want the technology, but we need some protocols as to how it's used and how to make sure that there are some safeguards there for the public. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, and thank you for being here today. And I do wish that FEMA had been here. I think they would have been an integral part of this discussion. I echo a lot of the concerns from my colleagues that I've heard today, and appreciate your candid comments as well about the challenges we still have moving forward, but the good things that are happening with the alerts. One of the things I do have concerns about sometimes, particularly in the state of Nevada, where we have a very diverse and growing population, are language barriers. I know Ms. Folks and Mr. Bergman, you talked a little bit about this and the actions that were taken in 2016 to enable Spanish language alerts. Can you talk a little bit more about that and describe how that works to ensure understandable alerts are sent to everyone, and then not just Spanish language alone? In Nevada, particularly in southern Nevada, we have a large Filipino population. Tagalog is an important language, obviously, and that's a barrier for those who do not speak Spanish. So can you talk a little bit about language barriers and how you address those and where the gaps are and what we should be doing to also keep that in mind and when we're talking about reaching out to everyone in our communities when there is a crisis or a concern of a natural disaster?
Well, as you noted, the Commission back in 2016 adopted rules to facilitate Spanish language via alerts. We do currently have the broader issue that is pending before us that we're still considering regarding other languages, and to what extent we should be looking at alerts in other types of languages.
Not there yet, though.
Not there. It's still it's pending.
Mm-hmm. And then, Mr. Bergman, if you don't mind, talking a little bit about how you, particularly with Spanish, how you overcome that barrier with the technology.
Sure, Senator. I think we certainly agree with you and think that's an important improvement. It's one that we're working diligently to implement. And then just would flag, again, the addition of URLs plays an important role as well, too, right? Because we think often of we as a bell ringer. Right, the idea is that you're letting folks know that there's an issue and then giving them the opportunity to go and get additional information. So together, those two tools we think will be very valuable for consumers, particularly for those who speak languages other than English as well, too.
Thank you. And besides language barriers, and I echo my colleagues again, there's geographic barriers, rural communities, particularly in Nevada and across the country, that are still struggling to have broadband access to be able to use some of the technology that's out there that's providing this information. I know this is an area where we've talked and will continue to support to bring resources and funding to our rural communities to connect them, but to me this is just a crisis as well, that they are not connected right now, and it's a focus for many of us. Let me ask you this, cybersecurity. Is there any concern about hackers hacking into an alert system in any manner whatsoever? Have we seen any of that, or is this something that you're thinking about or making sure you're addressing in the infrastructure?
The FCC has addressed the issue of cybersecurity, particularly with respect to the EAS, through its advisory committee. You may or may not recall that back in 2013, a hacker gained access to EAS equipment at various broadcast stations across the country. We conducted an investigation. We asked our advisory committee to come up with best practices that EAS participants could use to make their equipment more secure. In addition to which, the FCC, through its advisory committees, has developed best practices for really all the communication sectors to address security risk management, specifically how to implement the NIST framework.
The best practices are there, but there's no guarantee that they're going to be adopted.
We have taken steps to strongly encourage communication service providers to implement those best practices. We also work with industry organizations, and many of the industry organizations, for example, NAB, has done a lot to encourage its members to implement those best practices.
Right, but we're still at the stage of encouragement and not necessarily mandated that these being implemented, right? Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the conversation today.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you. I wanted to thank the chair and the ranking member for today's hearing. I also want to thank our witnesses for participating in this very important discussion. As a proud graduate of the University of Hawaii at Manoa, go Rainbows. No one else? No one else in the room. There's never anybody from not even you. Not even you. What does that say? Hawaii's recent false alarm is a fascinating test case, I think, because for federal and state and local policymakers, on one hand, it worked exactly the way it was supposed to. It was a false alarm, but the execution of the alarm actually worked as it was designed. A message was sent by an alerting authority and effectively disseminated to the targeted population. On the other hand, it was sent in error, terrifying the entire state for nearly an hour. I actually landed in South Korea on my way to the DMZ when it popped up on my phone saying that this had happened. The situation really exposed some gaps in the training processes and ergonomics of the software of the alerting authority. And Mr. Bergman, Mr. Matheny, it seems to me that the questions raised and the gaps identified in the Hawaii case focus more on alerting authorities and FEMA jurisdiction than the FCC and the alerting disseminators. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. I agree with the way you outlined it, which is that the broadcast infrastructure worked. The transmission worked. The message did get out. Unfortunately, in this case, it was a mistaken message. And so I think that as we've been discussing today, it requires us all, in particular on the FEMA side, to revisit who can generate an alert and how that alert is generated. But as it relates to the dissemination and the transmission, I think, as you've stated, that piece of the process worked as designed.
Mm-hmm. Senator Duckworth, I would agree as well, too. On the wireless side, the alert was delivered exactly as intended. And I think one of the key focuses of this hearing is making sure that we have public trust and confidence in the system. And I think we can certainly say we have that on the delivery side. Understand the committee's appropriate focus on making sure that that trust extends across the entire system, but the system performed well on the wireless side.
Great, thank you. And so I want to sort of contrast that with something that my colleague, Senator Sullivan, talked about, the recent tsunami warning in Alaska. I think that's more of an appropriate test case where an emergency alert was sent to a wide swath of residents, many who were in the danger zone, but then a lot of folks who were outside of the danger zone and probably did not need to be alerted. The Alaska example exposes a potential gap in the wireless emergency alert system's effectiveness in large rural environments. And I have this situation in Illinois where I have Chicago, where I have a couple of major metropolitan areas, but then large rural communities. My understanding is that in Anchorage, residents received an alert at 12:36 a.m., even though they were not in the danger zone geographically. And I can appreciate alerting authorities' interest in erring on the side of caution, but it seems more likely that forecast boundaries and census boundaries combined with technology limitations also played a role in those folks in Anchorage receiving the alert. Ms. Falke, Senator Sullivan, touched on this, but has the FCC has it done any after-action analysis of Alaska's recent tsunami warning to determine the WIA's effectiveness in this instance?
We are in the process of looking into it, yes.
You are, okay. Do you have any idea how long that review might take, or if we'll be able to see the results of that?
At this point, I can't give a specific timeline, but as always, my team moves very carefully and very expeditiously. Wonderful.
Mr. Bergman, what can you tell us about the effectiveness of geo-targeting technology, and where are the gaps? Which emergency situation is WIA's least suited, and where should industry, the FCC, and Congress focus our attention? And is there an issue with somebody who may have the GPS locator turned off on their phones?
So thanks, Senator. I think you put your finger on one of the most important improvements that we're poised to make, which is improving the geo-targeting of wireless emergency alerts. And the example that you talked about, this is exactly why we think about alerts, is trying to target it to the folks who are actually in danger and not over-alerting. So there are two components to that. One, we've implemented now, which is taking advantage of greater capabilities within the network to go below the county level so that alert originators can draw the polygon, the geographic area that they want to reach, and so they can do that today. And the next step in that will be taking advantage not just of the network, but also of the capabilities in the device. And so there, turning on features like location is obviously critically important to that. You want to make sure that you can take advantage of that location information in order to appropriately geo-target it. Now, I think a comforting piece of information there is if the geo-targeting is turned off, they'll still receive the message. So it's not as if the consumer would not receive the message in that circumstance.
Thank you, and I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Duckworth. Senator Wicker.
Mr. Lysenko, thank you for being here, and thank you for your written testimony. On page 9 of your written testimony, you talk about the Hawaii amateur radio operators during the recent false alarm. How were these operators able to disseminate a cancellation notice about Hawaii's ballistic missile false alarm before others were able to do so? And can you explain how amateur radios were able to provide that notice before others?
Yeah. Senator Wicker, first let me start by thanking you for your continuing support of amateur radio and your bill S-1534.
Thank you, and I might point out that Senator Blumenthal is a co-sponsor of that.
Yes,
and
sir.
I appreciate his bipartisan support for this.
Thank you. As I had mentioned earlier, ironically, amateur radio members in Hawaii had just been drilling 20 hours before the actual false alarm. So everything was fresh on their minds. Now, because they are able to work outside of the local infrastructure and they were not participants within the actual initial notification, they got word out through various VHF and UHF repeaters about the false alarm within 13 minutes after the initial alarm. They were picking up information from various sources, including a Coast Guard vessel that was just outside of the area. And as a result, because they were able to disseminate that information freely within the 13 minutes, they were able to get that word out right away. Whereas there was a lot of confusion in the area to them as well, because they were taught to listen for a certain type of siren warning that never came. So they were dependent upon information that they were gleaning from within the community itself.
Okay. Well, let me then switch to Katrina.
Okay.
Why, in situations like Hurricane Katrina, are the amateur radios so much more resilient and able to be there as a backup to the more well-known forms?
Well, for a number of reasons. First of all, we're not dependent upon the infrastructure to operate. If power goes down, we're able to use generators, solar power panels, batteries, what have you. And because we understand how radio works, we're able to adapt very quickly to any situation, whereas most first responders are using technology that they really can't adapt to a given situation because they don't have a basic understanding. We're able to walk into a situation, take notice of the surroundings, what kind of operation would be effective at that point, and then move along those lines very quickly. The big thing is that when all else fails, we really are able to provide emergency communications as required.
Okay, so so things are okay, but why is the new legislation so important? What would it give us that we don't have?
Well, you have to remember that amateur radio is unique in that we are disseminated geographically throughout the entire country. So very often what will happen is we'll have amateur radio operators both within and outside of a disaster area. That gives us a unique ability to disseminate information from within a disaster zone that others don't have. And the fact that we're not dependent upon the infrastructure then gives us the ability to work outside of it. So that, for instance, during Sandy, I'm from, if you can't tell from my accent, I'm from Brooklyn. We had devastation throughout the coasts of both New Jersey and New York going out to Long Island. The flooding was so severe that we had people who were stuck in their homes, obviously waiting for help. We had amateur radio operators who were inside of the flood zone and were able to send messages to first responders outside of the flood zone as to where people needed help. And very often in an emergency of that nature, it's as important to know where you need help and where you don't need help so you don't waste the resources that you have, which are limited during a disaster. So you don't want to send a first responder to the wrong address when there's nobody there to save. And we learned that, that it's that dissemination of resource that is a strong point for us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. Senator Schatz, anything else for the good of the order? Well, I think we've pretty well covered the subject today with the folks that are here. And as I mentioned earlier, there are some folks who are not here, I think, who could shed considerable light on some of the other aspects of the way this process works. But it's clear to me, at least, and I think most of the members of this committee, that we need to make some changes, at least with respect to the kind of alert that was issued in Hawaii. When it's a nuclear attack, I think the chain in that alert system needs to be modified to reflect the seriousness of the threat. Not that any of them aren't serious, but obviously this is a very different sort of threat. So, but thank you so much for the work that your various organizations do in alerting the public, and encourage you to continue to work to develop and refine those processes and technologies so that we can become even better and hopefully more efficient in seeing that people have the notifications they need in the face of various disasters that come our way. So thank you. We will keep the record open for members who on the committee who would like to submit questions for the record for a couple of weeks, and would ask the witnesses as soon as they can to get those responses in, preferably in a couple of weeks' time, so we can close out the record of the hearing. And we again appreciate all of you being here today. With that, this hearing is adjourned. Part of this. It doesn't have anything to do with the origination of the alert or the sort of the clearinghouse for those alerts. So those are roles. I think each of those respective roles are things that we'll look at, and if there are things that can be refined and it takes legislation to do that, we'll certainly take a look at it.
When's that hearing going to be anyway? And you'll talk with, you said, FEMA officials and others to sort of kind of just gather more information, or what's your next step?
Well, I think it is. There will be, we think at least, there will be a DHS authorization bill moving at some point, and so if there were an opportunity to legislate in this space, it'd probably be in conjunction with that bill. But we're going to have another hearing, follow-up hearing, field hearing out in Hawaii. We haven't stated the date on that yet, but so we'll get, hopefully be able to get FEMA and some of the other folks that weren't able to be here today at that hearing, and we'll continue to sort of drill down and figure out what needs to be fixed and how to do that. What's the best way to do that?
How soon that field hearing might be, even if there's not a specific date? Just roughly.
We're still discussing it, trying to figure out when we can do it to kind of maximize the opportunity for members to attend, which getting to Hawaii usually means it's got to be over one of the congressional work period breaks. So we'll figure that out and let you guys know when we know when that is.
Focusing on Hawaii because of the false alert. I mean, like you heard Senator Cantwell today talk about tsunami alerts. I mean, there's other alert systems that work just like Hawaii.
Yeah, and that's why I think that, you know, we have to figure out, in this case, is my understanding, the way it worked is that FEMA, through this IPAWS system, can delegate out, in this case it was to a state agency, some of that responsibility for, you know, the alert. And then, and whether or not that process needs to be modified is something we'll take a look at. I mean, clearly in the event of a nuclear attack, that's NORAD, that's presidential, and I think that's what Senator Schatz is attempting to get at with his bill, which, as I said, on the surface makes sense to a lot of us. But we definitely need to figure out how we keep what happened this time from happening again, and we're still trying to put all those pieces together.
So would that bill be under the jurisdiction of your committee?
Probably not. I mean, his bill will be under his GAC.
And so you would not have a markup then?
Well, we probably wouldn't unless there was something in it that triggered our jurisdiction. But unless it's if it has FCC components in it, then it would come under our committee's jurisdiction. But so we'll take a look at that and what he's proposing and see if there are other things as we take into consideration what we've heard today, and then at the subsequent field hearing, and see if there are other things, like I said, that we can do to refine and make this system work better, and hopefully avoid the what I think was a very, you know, potentially catastrophic situation, but if nothing else, certainly embarrassing situation.
I wonder if that framework you were talking about for best practices, maybe that would be under your jurisdiction, so maybe you might have a piece of it.
And that's true, and that's why we asked the question today of the FCC, and you know, clearly they don't have the authority right now to do that, so that's something we'd have to take a look at. Thanks. Ms. Folks, thank you for being here. Appreciate it. Yeah.